Welcome to what is a nice new stage. And we've had a series of sessions with AV Magazine over the last day or two. And this is a one I've been wanting to do for quite some time because we have not included architects, and it's only recently we've really reconnected with consultants really over the last year or so, into the entire AV process. And I think it's been a much overlooked area of our coverage, which we're trying now to rectify by understanding how all the various processes work and how each member in those process chains works together, and how AV can benefit, because every time we come into these new buildings, we're constantly criticising everybody for saying, well, we're the last in the chain, of course the architects don't include us, this, that and the other. Couldn't be further from the truth actually. But I thought, well, we need to know by getting some real live professionals in this room about what they do and how the AV architectural consultant chain actually works, how it actually works, and how we can be part of it and treat it accordingly. So within this mix, we have very kindly attracted and asked a number of professionals in their particular chosen fields to join us today. And I'll start from my left. The esteemed Parrish, sports venue architecture consultant from AECOM. So, some of those amazing sports stadia are the work of this man, that you probably hadn't realised. So we're lucky to have him on board. Helen Berresford, who's a partner and head of IDSR. Christian Bozeat, at the end, who is managing director of macom UK, and it's out of sequence, I hadn't accommodated that, sorry about that. And Vince Simpson, who is a fit-out project management director, in fact the fit-out project management director, not of CBRE UK. And can I just ask you, because you talked to there, what does a fit-out project director do?
That's not fair.
I think so, because we need to know, because we are doing it at a different level here, and we need to know what everybody does for us to be able to progress on to the next step.
Sure. I'm sure most people probably know what a fit-out project manager does.
No, don't
but we
anything.
would represent end users, very much occupier focused. Could be education, could be healthcare, could be anything, but I specialise in end user commercial occupiers. And the idea is we get a client from A to B, in a nutshell. Various stages, get the brief, understand what we've got to try and do and achieve. Timing is a big part of that, budget is a big part of that. And then get the right consultants on board, procure contractors, and then monitor construction, in a nutshell. You're now a project manager.
No, that's it. Well, we didn't know, honestly. And the nature of the relationship between all three of you, between architect, consultant, and the AV community, it needs to be really defined. From a working relationship point of view, actually realise the architectural profession and the AV community are much closer than you realise. But we hadn't hitherto seen that because we hadn't actually talked to any real live architects and found out what they actually do and how they work with the AV community. And here we have an assortment of people who have gone through these processes and worked with the REBA stages and everything else, so we can actually get real live experience and think ahead about how the relationships can evolve and work really efficiently. Christian, how roughly from your point of view does the relationship work? Consultant and architect and end user.
I actually think that the relationship between AV and architects when we're working directly together is really good, and there's a lot of great work being done. I think that actually the issue lies maybe elsewhere in the chain, because when we work together and we can help the architectural teams inform their designs to incorporate new working processes and new technologies, and new solutions, the architectural teams are always very willing to understand and help us to deploy those. I think the challenge comes when we both have that key client that has a different set of understandings, or they have to achieve an outcome, and that we have the time pressures of trying to deliver against that outcome and the cost impact of that outcome. So that's where I think the relationship is a little challenged between us and the architects.
Okay. So how does the architectural profession view AV? I thought I had to throw a little chestnut in. How would you, Helen? Please.
Integral, I think it is. It is integral, and I think you're right, actually, Christian. That in terms of being a challenge, when we find our client brings on the AV consultant right at the end of the project, and we've designed these beautiful meeting rooms with beautiful credenzas that deal with all the hospitality element that they're demanding from a meeting room, and then the screen doesn't fit, and a lot of the time it's very prosaic stuff in terms of the hardware, rather than actually really getting to the bottom of the brief and the requirement of the brief and working out what you need from your technical sort of solution.
And that fits in with the time issue. From our perspective, we'd like to be involved with our clients much earlier in the process to help them define their standards and their processes. We have to do it with IT, with the guys to make sure that all of the hardware is tested from a security perspective, it's from a functional perspective, it all works. Then we have to look at the working processes as well for the different teams and how they work and what tools they need. And once we've understood what tools they need, because it's not just a TV on a wall, it's a whole set of software tools and different types of screens and different solutions and different working processes. When we've got that, if we can do that early enough, we can bring a tool set which allows us to help inform your space, because it's got to be a nice environment to work in, but we're changing the working processes from just a screen on the wall to maybe an entire wall that's written on and a boundless canvas that they can use there. And we are trying to get around some of the physical issues and the physics of speakers and microphone placement, but if we can work with you earlier, it helps us.
But I think understanding what it's all about is really key. We've been really lucky recently. We've just been working with Deloitte on their headquarters in London, and they've incorporated an intelligent building system, which is I won't even start to explain how that works, and that's not my expertise. But what was brilliant was that we took a brief from 12,000 users, which was pretty complex, and that's quite an analog process with lots of people wanting different things from a building. And then we had a strand of the briefing process that was very much technology based. And so within the top 10 of the requirements in terms of the intelligent building was easy access, usability, so being able to walk into a meeting room and have stuff working for them there and then. And it's not just in the meeting rooms, it's sort of when they're in the cafe needing to have that interaction with the systems. And at the end of the day, they've provided an app which is so simple on your phone that you can walk into the building and it knows you and it recognises you when you walk in, and it's starting to create a much more straightforward, sort of easy use case for people, so less complicated.
Yeah, no, and it's happening in a lot of spaces, not just in the corporate offices, but obviously in the stadia and different environments. But that process to get from what that brief is, from a technical perspective, to make sure that it all works and actually everything's tested and functioned, so that when we get to site and Vince is monitoring everybody and making sure that things are coming together, it's not just being tested there, because that can lead to some challenges.
I think there's got to be something. I would say there's two very different nature of project and client, actually. There are the kind of clients and nature of project that do, frankly, just need a screen on a wall, but and that's a very simplistic kind of use. But then the other end of the scale, where you do need something far more than that, or even a little bit more than that, needs some thought. But to kind of put the process into context, a lot of my clients, most of my clients, there's some kind of time pressure, and it's big scale stuff. It's buying buildings, it's lease events, it's lease renewals, it's rent reviews, all that kind of really early upfront property stuff does drive their process. Mm-hmm. And when you've got real estate people, agents, project managers focusing on that, you do lose sight of the fact that we need time for other people, and it's not just AV. Mm. So that's not an excuse, but that is one of the fundamental reasons that the life cycle compresses people like us, actually. Yeah.
So they're working on tight margins, so they have a straightforward plan to just finish that building as
well,
early as
it's
possible
generally property
and
driven.
avoid penalties.
Yeah, rather than construction driven. Yeah.
I think this is what the AV community tends not to appreciate, is they assume architects are a bit lofty, and there's a purity of vision that doesn't perhaps include AV, which is the messy bit that needs to be included. And so I'm trying to press to people that actually the whole thing is included within the brief and everything else. But there's been so much misinformation bandied about that we're spending now a great deal more time trying to educate people about the process work. So they'll be looking at things a lot differently and trying to. Some are already getting up the food chain now and trying to brief more accurately.
Yeah.
And I hadn't realised that from your design practice, there were much. We had an interior design, a lot of interior design elements of big architectural practice are now involved, which you hadn't realised with AV. And I hadn't realised that was a section within architectural practices that was specifically involved. Well, that's the recent thing for us. We didn't know. And I think is that the general breakdown of how architectural practice are organised when they're closest to the AV equation?
I think so, because a developer recently described buildings and a big whilst people are really expensive for an organisation, buildings are probably the next biggest kind of investment, and so they do, they can make or break an organisation. So it's pretty serious when you've got you are doing a change of your property. But I think because of the increasing understanding of the complexity of how organisations work, we find ourselves more and more involved with taking a brief for an occupier. And as you say, some of the occupiers might be just lift and shift and think that they're literally going to take them. How we work before, slight betterment move to there, but others are really, really transformational. But either way, even if it's a lift and shift, stuff changes and there's an opportunity from that change. And I'm an architect by training and have designed lots of base builds, and we often get involved right at the beginning. Recently we just finished, handed over BBC Wales, where 9 years ago we started, should they stay or should they go, and then they decided to go, then we helped them procure a new building. And with that, certainly their MPI group, which is their technical group, 40% of their spaces is technical spaces that were heavily AV technical orientated. So we needed to take the brief for that, before we chose the building. And I know that's an unusual scenario, having that technical complexity. But basically, you had these studios that effectively need to float within a building that's right next to a railway station. So actually, the brief for the AV, the quality of the sound. I mean, BBC have their own kind of sort of sound criteria, as I'm sure you know, Clive. To be able to understand all of that and know that at the end of the day, when the developers provided this new building that you've procured, that you can roll a camera straight across a completely flat resin floor and get perfect sort of filming. It's quite sophisticated stuff.
And you had 9 years, obviously, to do that, which is great because actually you're able to take that transformation process through from end to end. Because there are a lot of considerations. AV, it's easier to say what we don't touch than what actually we do touch in a lot of spaces, and and that whole user experience of a space is part of that. So to get those pieces right, to be able to think about the flooring, where the induction loops are, where they come in the program, how the users react with the space, what's the operational processes behind all of that to get a building right. Takes a long time. So the more we can get those situations where we're early on in that process and working as part of the design stage. I wanted to ask a question from yourselves as architects. How do we change and obviously Vince as well? How do we change that thought process maybe within the project teams and the clients teams to bring that AV consultancy forward in their process so that we can work with the architectural practices when you're starting to do that brief gathering, so we can help with our knowledge? Where do you see that fitting?
It probably depends a bit on the building type that we're looking at, because for the last 40 plus years I've focused on stadium design and arenas. And to put it all in perspective, I think we must be the AV industry's favorite, because the first major project I did was part of a new redevelopment of Cheltenham Racecourse at the end of the 70s. And we were really proud in the office because, hey, this thing was the biggest project in the whole country. About that time, the people in Hong Kong announced that they just bought a new jumbo screen, and it was, I can't remember, 2 or 3 times the price of our new building that we were all so proud of. And the whole industry ebbs and flows. We're getting to stages where every single project that I've been involved in ever since, there's been an AV person, part of that team, from as early as possible. Now, ideally, that's day one. And the reason for that is that the forms of the buildings, what we're going to put in them, what we're trying to do in terms of future-proofing and so on, has to be thought about early. Otherwise, we can't put it in probably. It becomes too difficult. How do you find space for the world's biggest screen in a Dallas Cowboys if you haven't thought about it at the beginning? It's very difficult. And what we're always trying to do is create a better and better experience, and the AV industry contributes an awful lot to that. In fact, it's got to the stage where we're having to say, how do we improve the experience so that it isn't just AV, which you can watch in your living room, which before too long you'll be in your own little sphere, and it'll be like you're wherever you want to be, and it'll be generated electronically, so you won't know whether it's real or not. And what we're thinking now is, actually, we've got to be focusing on here and now experiences. Like sitting here is not the same as doing it with a virtual reality version of people or something that's been beamed from the other side of the world. That whole idea, though, of thinking about it from the beginning is starting to work. My first example of it was Millennium Stadium, where there was a 5-line brief for the stadium. It might have been 6. It's a long time ago. I can't remember. It had to be 75,000 seats. It had to be a closing roof stadium. It had to be this. It had to be that. And it had to recreate the atmosphere of the existing Cardiff Arms Park. Now that meant sound. That meant the brilliant singing of the Welsh. And it meant that the stadium, the Millennium Stadium, was designed acoustically as well as all the other aspects that were being thought of.
I think the low-tech, the low-tech sort of face-to-face, analog world with the digital world is a really interesting one, and I think that's probably what sometimes suffers when AV technical becomes so complicated. A user can't understand how to work their, the TV when they walk into their room. I mean, I think the best thing to do is absolutely get the vision in sort of right at the beginning. I mean, going back to BBC Wales, which was a project we worked on with AECOM as well. The vision actually the driver and the remit for BBC is to bring the audience in. So any building needs to do that, absolutely fundamentally. Real challenge, because they're a terrorist target at the moment, so there's all sorts of issues with that. But in Cardiff, they effectively, even on match day, when you've got 80,000 rugby supporters walking from around kind of the Millennium Stadium, they'll now be able to walk into the building at BBC, and there will be a really tremendous sort of AV experience in the atrium that can say all sorts of different things in that space. But that really tick the box of bringing the audience in, because when the audience comes into a media building, what do they want to see? They want to see some wonderful sort of content. But I think it's also about the interlink between the content. It's the software and the hardware, if you like, that's really fundamental. What can you do? What really wonderful experiences can you bring people when they are literally step by step walking through, going to a rugby match, and then they interact with that digital? I think there's a lot more creativity we can do to kind of make those two worlds work more creatively.
I absolutely agree with all that. I would answer your question, Christian, by saying there should be a first contact principle. Because a lot of the time, certainly in the occupier world, the first person that occupier may see is an agent. And they're out doing building viewings and they're talking at that level again. But I think the first contact principle should be, right, what are we trying to achieve? And that could be an agent, project manager, whoever it may be, sometimes an architect, interior designer. But we should start to ask those questions and challenge the fundamental reason you're stood there in the first place. I need to find 30,000 square feet and move X people. Great, that's part of the problem. What happens after that? And I've been there myself. I've been out on viewings where I've seen clients fall in love with a space because of the shape of it. It's got a nice glass facade. It's south-facing, so that's exactly where they want to put the meeting rooms, and they're going to be glass meeting rooms. And all of those kind of stuff that we've all been through before, and it's not impossible, but now we start to actually challenge and question and go, right, let's start defining that brief. And I really do think that we as professionals, whether it be designers or project managers, and I'm putting my hand up as well, we've got a duty to extract that brief and challenge it and guide that into something that actually works, so that end users get the importance of what all this is about.
I think we've actually got a role in AV that can help you extract that. So I was talking at the Smart Building conference at the beginning of the week, and I raised a series of questions about smart buildings and how you're going about to deliver intelligent buildings, and they hold a whole series of challenges of their own, very similar to those in AV. But if you're looking for a space, let's take a corporate environment. If you're looking for a space, if we're working with the client beforehand, we can monitor and manage, we'll monitor and see what spaces they're using, how they're using them, talk to them about their processes, which then can inform that space purchase. We can talk to them about the BMS system and understand this is how we want it to interact and react with different systems.
Yeah.
So we can give a better brief and help give a better brief to you guys so that you can go and find a building that has a specific type of BMS solution or a particular network infrastructure so that we can communicate. All of that piece can be mapped out. If it's from a new build space, we can help you. We can help design that.
But I think the brief is fundamental and more important. And I think if there is good news, at the moment we're spending more and more time having a really good briefing exercise with a client, even if they think they just want to do it on the hop and go, right, get me into this new building, lift and shift. I think the fundamental use case of a brief and the business case that goes to the executive is more and more important. I mean, as space gets more expensive, as people are and talent hunting is really, really key. We find ourselves, actually having more of an importance in picking up that initial brief with the client to understand exactly what they need from that real estate, because you can't waste it anymore, particularly in places like London when costs are hugely expensive. So you need to make the most of it. So all of the work we do with organisations, Deloitte being a good example. I mean, they have 2 people to 1 desk effectively, but with intelligent buildings they're able to have people sort of select their site, their position, and use a very, very simple app to go the Deloitte app, to go and choose their meeting rooms, to go and log on grab their coffee in the morning all ready for them so they can walk up. The lift comes when they appear once they've booked a meeting room or an office or a space on one of the floors. There's a real shift to kind of really make that efficient, effective journey in terms of use case.
We spend a lot of time on that as well, understanding what it is that people want from their space, why they want it, gathering that information, that data. Why do they want it? What are they going to do when they've got it? How are they going to use it? What's important? What are those important pieces for the most expensive asset, the people? To how are you going to utilize that, and what is the best space you're going to do that? And across stadia and those sorts of public environments, it's a very, what are you wanting to achieve? Why are you doing this? What information do you want? Retail is the same. How can you make best use out of that space? So all of those tools are available, but we do find it a bit of a challenge from an AV to try and come into the process when the architectural process, and from what I'm hearing, it is great because you guys are all set up for it. You're bringing in AV and technology in, but the REBA process doesn't bring us until much later in, and sometimes the challenges of cost consultants and project managers are basically to fill that role. I've got a project which is a timeline there. I'm not really interested in what's happening into the client's domain after that time, because I've done my project, thanks very much. I'm not
harsh.
But it sometimes it feels like that.
It does. I can absolutely understand where you're coming from, and I'm not going to defend the property life cycle because I agree with what you're saying. But sort of come back to that property aspect, it does drive everything. And one of the biggest reasons that we're not all involved a bit sooner is because people and companies are guarded about the deal that's happening in the background and the transaction. And it becomes right, we've now signed on the dotted line, it's now official, we can go. And then it's panic stations. And it's almost the cloak of a secrecy until that point in time, often. So I can't defend it, but that is one of the big driving factors, and it frustrates me as well.
I mean, from my point of view, is my microphone working, by the way? Good.
Yes.
it seems to me that the whole process is becoming more complex, and therefore you have to evaluate which skill sets you require, where in the chain those skill sets appear, and who's in charge of the process. It seems to me, I suppose, are architects becoming more fully functional and acquiring more responsibility for elements of a project, or is it the consultants acquiring more expertise of the vision, if you like? I mean, I'm talking about US example here, ESI Design specifically, who came over, and they are sitting in between the client and the integrators. They control the vision, they also control the practical implementation of that vision, and they have a multifunctional set of departments that handle, and they're all former architects, but they sit there as consultants, and they have expertise through all the different markets, and they bring that to bear on the way that vision is interpreted and then appears within that client's site. I wonder how representative that was over here, or whether that's just that's one signal model that one company does, and how representative it was.
What you'll find is there's the entire spectrum of different ways of doing it. But as far as I'm concerned, it has to be something that runs throughout the project. The sort of work that we do, they're fairly long time scale because they're complex buildings and they get ever more sophisticated. But as part of that is the evolution of IT technology and marketing, i.e. the cost of things, is varying while you're doing it. And it's a little bit like the way that architects have to work. A project manager draws a progress graph. You go from here to there. That's straightforward. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work like that. You would excuse the
It never does.
poking bit of fun here. Actually, it goes round and round and round because you've got so many iterative processes,
heartbeat.
and what you're doing is
It's a living organism, it really is.
yeah, you're trying to optimize lots of different things, and so many of them conflict with each other. And that comes down from the basic geometry of it, in a way, in a stadium, where the seats are and how far away they are and what quality the view is. They all conflict. What you do for the acoustics, it conflicts. It wants a different thing from what the sightlines want. And so it goes on. But what we're always trying to do is get the best for the client when it's handed over, and something that can then evolve over time. And that's even more difficult sometimes, but there are opportunities that we try and take.
I mean,
And-
one of the things I think maybe we need is, although I don't like the word strategy, I think right at the beginning of a job, we're aware, having just probably come off another job which is completed, prosaically, let's take that meeting room screen. Oh, it didn't fit the lovely piece of joinery. What are we going to do about this? Because the latest technology is different from when we planned it. I think we can't totally guess what extraordinary things are going to happen in terms of technology, but we can have a bit of a go at the beginning, right at the beginning, and have it on. And every briefing form we have will always have, IT, technology, AV, etc. And perhaps maybe one of the links that can assist is that whilst not all the projects are, wonderfully integrated, like BBC, where you have a huge technical team that you're providing for, because effectively a lot of it is studio space. Maybe there's a way that we could work together to be able to come up with the elements in that initial brief. That means you're not necessarily directly in there interviewing all of the thousands of people in Deloitte's case, but you could, if we had some of the criteria, we could then ask the right strategic questions at the beginning, and then when we get to the stage where we, and we know as designers that don't, I'll tell my guys, don't ever fit a screen, with 10 mil tolerance into joinery. Just make it more loose fit, because things will change.
Well, and we're the word strategy is yes, it's a difficult word to use, but we are always looking to take our clients through that journey. And the thing with technology is, as we can see, it's not going to stop. And so we do have very much to take into account of what's going to happen. How are we going to build a space that is where they are now? We've got this transformation. Okay, within that time we can set expectations and we can get here. And then we can carry on looking at that process. So from our perspective, we need to talk to the client about a whole series of other things that the practical elements of the technology support, the process for testing and designing those pieces to make sure they work functionally, but also that they're able to sit on the network and design the client's network. And so there's a whole series of things that sit underneath the actual physical space that we need to ensure is in place at the same time as being able to deliver on the other piece. The whole process behind digital signage and how are we going to create content, and who's allowed to create it, and who signs it off, and who puts it onto the screen, and the whole piece around the collaborative tools, and how are you going to utilize them, and do they fit into Teams or Google Docs or whatever that they're actually doing? How do those pieces of software work? So we have a multifaceted piece, and the physical element of what we do is one of those, but the actual working environment or the client environment is another one, and the IT infrastructure behind that. So for us to have that strategy before, we're going from here to here, and actually in the middle of that we've got our building and the construction process for this new building or this new space, that helps us get to that point quicker to help you get that information.
I would say that thankfully there has been a positive step in that direction, and it's a bit of a trend that I've noticed over the last 2 to 3 years perhaps. And it uses the word strategy. It's workplace strategy, and my colleagues here will recognise that. On larger projects, I don't know, let's guess at 100,000 square feet plus, there would be a workplace consultant comes on to review how you operate at the minute, the good, the bad and the ugly, and then your aspirations for how you want to operate in a different way or in a different building, whatever it may be. So that's a workplace review effectively. And that takes into account many aspects such as utilisation studies, collecting data, technology, questioning, maybe not to a fully technical degree, but it's a start. But the positive step is actually that threshold starting to come down. And we've got, and I've done many projects over the last 2 years that are kind of smaller end of the scale, 15 to 20,000 square feet clients, end users, that are really actually asking those questions. How do I work now? How do I answer what I want to do? Because I don't know. And we bring a consultant in to do that.
And that use case, I think,
it's the tip of the iceberg, but it helps.
Is fundamental. I think we're doing some work with you with a media company at the moment, CBRE, and we, in terms of that workplace brief, I mean, effectively that's what we're talking about. Yeah. You know, it used to be how many desks, what square footage, what amount of real estate. Yeah. Now it's who are your people, how do they work, what kind of different use cases do they do, what kind of agility do they have, how are they digitally represented and supported. I always remember the story of taking a brief when we took the brief to move BBC to the north, and they were really keen to absolutely refresh in the digital age. They were building a digital platform from a very analogue platform. The only way to do that was to leave Shepherd's Bush and move somewhere different. When they moved into the new building, and it took a year to take that brief, I remember interviewing one of the sports guys who turned around and went, right, well, I'm a fixed worker, I sit here, I need a desk, 100% of the time I'm at my desk. And we had this dilemma that we were doing the workplace strategy and the utilisation study, and we looked at our list and went, actually, no, you're not. You're at Wimbledon, you're doing the cricket, you're at Lord's, you're only in the building probably about once every 2 weeks. Why are you saying you're fixed? And he was adamant he was fixed. And there was a moment where we turned around and went, we've got all these stats for all these people coming into this building. Why is this use case not working? And we realised that actually this individual, when he came into the building, was only there once every 2 weeks, and he needed to get up and running immediately walked in the building because his time in that building was so precious. So I think there's a really, really interesting factor about human behaviour in the workplace strategy and the empirical numbers, and how to sort of create a bridge link between those things is really, really fundamental.
No, I agree, totally.
Well, you touched upon this behavioural thing and our workplace thing beforehand, and this question how far that behavioural analysis should be down with the actual client rather than you having to think for them. It's an education process to be done that happens as early as possible. And this is a big thing within workspace design now, where we're looking at data, how spaces are used, so it feeds back into how you then design the next step on, based on how a space is being used. Now, you would have thought that might be common sense, but I think to most of the people in this space, and we're hearing that, I probably think 90% of them wouldn't have thought the data is only now coming on stream that it might be an issue for people to think and approach things in that way, and they haven't done so far. And that's why I think the joins are so difficult between architectural practice and interior design and consultants, because you look upon both doing almost like a similar thing at certain points. You're helping to make this creative vision work technically, and you're trying to evaluate and think, well, you know, coming from the other side, it's a question of where you meet and who controls that chain.
But specialists, I think, are a good thing. You know, you
Yes,
can
absolutely.
potentially have a house that does everything, and that's amazing for certain projects. But I think you know, with each of the different clients that you've been talking about, Vince, you know, sometimes you just want a little bit, sometimes you want a huge amount, like some of the big, you know, BBCs and Deloitte, etc., with 12,000 people. But I think it's a question of honing your input from people, you know, to suit the project and to enjoy the specialists. So I mean, we would never want to be, you know, we might translate some of that technical to a client when we're taking a brief and they're wondering about how many people they've got, what entertainment programs they're going to, you know, are making Strictly Come Dancing, and they're worrying about their audience figures, you know, versus X Factor. That's what they're worrying about. Yep. So they're not, although they're immensely technical, they're not going to be worrying about their workplace efficiency. But it's our job to take on that mantle. But it's also to work with people who really, really know some of the specialisms to support that. You know, activity-driven design is what we need, and so it's collaboration is really key.
And it's not just the activity-based design; it's about the the implementation of some of the great technology into sort of those public spaces as well, and that sort of, as you said, that all civic space and you know, sporting event space, and how do we come in to say, yes, you've got a great vision. And we're not the designers, we're not the ones with the great vision on that, but we can make sure that vision is realised if it's possible at all. So it's actually understanding what's the implications of that on the structure, on the space, as you said. How do we map the audio? How do we put that acoustically into that space?
And there's the informal civic as well. I mean, take, again, BBC is a wonderful example to talk about here, because as you walk through the entrance area in Cardiff now, you'll be able to walk through and be a wonderful AV on the wall there that tells you content of BBC, but equally the studios open up. So they'll be able to have not just the formal kind of productions, but they'll be able to just literally use furniture, loose furniture, and have Scrum 5 in an environment, a bit like the One Show, where people can just walk in and see that civic, informal happening in the building. And to me, that's the most exciting thing of all, to make this this content even more informal and friendly and interesting.
And the physics of those spaces and the physics of those environments are quite difficult. You said earlier about the speakers interfere with the sight lines, or however that works together. That's where the importance of doing that thing early on.
I think we've kind of gone through a loop in this conversation, which brings us back to answer the question of, you know, who should be identifying we need this team or we need these specialists. And I've got to put my hand up and say I think a big part of that is the project manager. I've got to, and I'm very conscious of what I'm saying, because we are generally the closest one, generally speaking, to start that brief off and understand what their vision is trying to achieve. And I think maybe that's where there needs to be a piece of learning, maybe from a client perspective, a consultant perspective, and I'm talking project manager, agent, you know, they're selling space at the end of the day, and then very closely behind a designer. Because if we can't challenge or actually help a client that doesn't know what they want and doesn't know where to start, then we've got to look in the mirror and actually figure out then, you know, are we actually fulfilling our obligations? But another thing I would say, generally speaking, a lot of clients, and I'm talking purely about occupier clients, not stadiums or anything like that, they go through this big property cycle, then they switch focus immediately to budget, can I afford it, where do I need to move money around? And unfortunately, some clients might want to spend more on a different type of carpet because it feels better than a different type of AV solution. Silly as that sounds, it happens daily. We wouldn't be on this stage now if it didn't. And then they kind of imagine there's this construction piece in the middle that just happens. And then it's furniture, will my staff be happy? Will the coffee machine work on day one? Because that's really important. And we've all seen it before. That's a big mind shift to go through for clients. But that is how a lot of clients' minds work.
I might differ you. I think often when the push comes to the shove, the client is much more interested in the technology in the building than they are the design. I think often the design is easily dropped from a client to that to focusing on gadgetry that may not be appropriate. So I think it's really, really important to have the right technology and the right solution.
Yep.
But it is a bit like porridge. It's not too hot, it's not too cold.
Yeah.
You do want the right solution, so you don't get that redundancy that makes people feel sort of cynical about the amount to spend in a building, because for example in an office we more and more use our mobile technology, our phones. So you're being aware that that's part of the solution is really important, and being wise to that.
It's a very big part of our scoping part of any project is to take, obviously when we come into the project, wherever we come into it, is to actually take that brief and to understand and to make sure that we map appropriate technology solutions to those needs. And we've got to take the client and to say, this is where you are now, this is what you've got, your vision is here. We've got to go through that process and map them into that space.
And it should be one solution.
We should be careful about thinking there's only one way you arrange these things, because it's not the case. There are plenty of projects where actually they happen without any project managers, and they can happen very efficiently. We have to be very careful as architects, for instance, to avoid getting a situation where we're not having direct contact with the client, because unless you have the background in that particular design type, you won't know which questions even to ask. So it's all down, a lot of it, to experience. But I think for most of the discussion today, what I feel is that it's reinforcing the idea that what you need is multidisciplinary design, and I mean genuine multidisciplinary design. Just because you're the one who's going to be putting a speaker up doesn't mean you shouldn't actually be able to give a view as to where it wants to go. We want to know where it should go. We want to know what the optimum would be. What we look for as architects, and I've been doing parametrics since the 70s as well, we look for people who can fit in with the design process. And what we want is everyone who works on that project to be able to plug into that process as efficiently as possible. And at the moment, structural engineers do it brilliantly. They'll work parametrically from day one. MEP, not really very good yet. It has to be said. They want a complete set of drawings and they'll draw a few lines on it, which doesn't help us. We want something that can be developed properly, and if they give us a plant room, we want to know it's the right size of plant room. The same thing applies to the AV and all the IT kit and so on. In the early stages, we want to know, what the brief is and what's going to go in there, which may be evolving during the course of the project, but we want to know very much where the roots are, what the sizes are, so that we can make the right provisions from the beginning, because that's the only way we're going to get a smooth run all the way through. And if we do that, then we can have a very efficient project for everyone involved in it.
And co-creation, it's all about co-creation, going back to real team fundamentals, the right people at the right time, whether it's a small project or a large project, being efficient about who comes in and comes involved and providing the best solution overall for the client is really, really key. And I think it can only be helped by a better interface with sort of our job is not AV at all, but if we understand what can be useful, then we can help in that process. But equally, if we have a dialogue with you, a really effective dialogue, and you're integrated into the team, then again we can create this really good co-creating team.
And I think if we're going to provide that information back from an architectural perspective into what you've got to, what needs to be taken account of in those things to provide some of those pieces, then we can have those conversations in the background to the IT teams and make sure that they're prepped and ready for the things that are going to happen on their side. So you're right. I think the creativeness of actually working parallel,
absolutely, It's. I think we can all agree on that. It's just it's the natural hurdles that have always been there that we've got to overcome. But I do think we're getting better.
Are we entering a new era of cooperation? I think we
Here
probably
and now,
are, aren't we?
you've
I
seen
think
it here
because,
first.
I feel because the nature of the workplace and what's required now is demanding it most probably.
And it's going upstream in the boardroom as well.
Yes.
And I think that makes a big difference, because if it's quite a low-key facility management solution, it tends to be a bit more pragmatic and prosaic. Whereas if you're going and taking a brief from the executive and they realise what the asset can do, the IT, the building, an intelligent building for an organisation, then you get the right decisions made at the right time.
Getting the buy-in from them is absolutely key, because they have the vision for their space or whatever their particular environment is. They've got the vision for it. They know what they want to achieve from it, and so getting that vision and understanding that, we can help all of us translate that into a good project.
I do think that it's happening already. It's an evolution, but actually it's a very exciting time for it, because the pace of change in AV technology and the increased understanding of the designers has come together now, and the future could be absolutely brilliant. Let's see how well everyone manages to get the most out of it.
I think a closing statement for me, which absolutely aligns with what Christian is passionate about, is the REBA plan of works, and while that captures the majority of things, I think there is a stage 0-1 question mark when it comes to this, and I know you're passionate about delving into that, and I think that's where we as an industry can support that and get behind that. Yeah.
So just to clarify, the REBA steps are processes that the architect goes through to fulfill a particular project. Is that right? How do they?
The whole team should
whole
follow
team
that
should.
structure. Yeah.
Is that happening regularly?
We do follow it, but
Right.
generally what happens, there are obvious, very brilliant exceptions to that, but in a general project scope, the REBA stages are where we are tendering against particular points and spaces within that, which means that we are coming in sometimes a little bit later, and the education of the project management teams and stuff is getting better to bring us in earlier, but it doesn't bring us in maybe as early as we would like.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Can I open it to the floor a bit? I mean, it's difficult to know the sort of mixture of people in the audience here. I mean, we had a couple of architects in the back there and a couple of consultants who seem to have moved on, sadly. They probably knew I was going to point them out and get questions from them. I do frighten people off like that. Any particular challenges you're facing that perhaps you'd like to share with us? And are you users or vendors or practitioners?
Any occupiers?
Occupiers?
No.
A lot of people looking at their phones. I don't like that sort of thing going on, really. It's not a halfway house for a phone message.
It's technology.
It's technology.
It's there all. That's what we're
But
here doing.
if you're true multitaskers, you can look at the phone and ask a question at the same time, presumably. Obviously not. Okay. Yes, Jerry, you have stayed with us. Thank goodness for that. Hello. Oh, hang on. We've got to throw this in, haven't we? Christian, are you very good at this sort of thing? You need to put it right up to your mouth, Jerry, so it's... Well done. Well done.
Excellent. Is this working? Yay.
It seems to be, as long as you keep it right up there.
I'm on the consultancy side, as Christian is, and part of my daily work is to engage with architects and the rest of the people involved in fit-out projects.
Right.
Mostly on the corporate side. So I think for the majority of what we do is, I mean, we are part of the design team, and it does feel like a team. But there are certain challenges which keep recurring, and some of the sort of challenges that I've been doing this for more than 20 years, and we're still getting some of the same sort of conversations coming up. In terms of sort of putting technology into spaces where they're just not practical. So, for example, before coming to ISC, I made a list of all the things I actually wanted to get from the show, and the majority of those were finding interesting or sort of different products to fit within existing projects that I'm working on to keep the architect happy, or to sort of meet particular challenges where there's a beautiful looking space, but it's completely impractical to implement AV into. And I just wondered whether, as part of the sort of formal training in architecture, that there is anything taken into consideration about AV. So, I mean, we've been working to sort of industry practices for, you know, there's some quite clearly defined practices in terms of sight lines, viewing distances, sort of the need for acoustics, and I don't know if anything actually gets...
Well, I think simply thanks Jerry, by the way, is AV within, you mean, is it part of a REBA qualification? I mean, clearly architects do have an appreciation of AV matters, but is it part of their formal qualification?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, it's great to see two architects on the panel that are not sort of technology phobic and...
yeah.
And,
well, I'm sure they're not. Architects aren't technology phobic, are they? Probably interested and passionate as the rest of them.
Some are technology phobic and others are the exact opposite, and it will come down to the individual, as with any industry. It's so long ago since I was at college that, you know, we've progressed beyond the abacus and so on, so I don't really know what they teach nowadays, but anyone with a fundamental understanding of physics and so on and geometry can usually understand most of the things that are relevant to you within the AV industry and are relevant to us within architecture. So I think it's really just a case of making sure that the points are discussed thoroughly enough to make sure that those you're dealing with have a grasp of it.
And I think what's happening with our younger generation, because we do have a young demographic in our practice, we've probably got about, not quite as many as AECOM for sure, but we've got about 380 architects. And the junior teams that come in from college, whether they study AV particularly at college, well, what there is an increasing passion towards sustainability, towards use case, towards function and form, and an aptitude to really engage with technology, to the point where we have to remind them what a pencil is. And I went and spoke to one of the team recently, and they're brilliant. Revit is amazing, something we haven't discussed. You know, we are drawing in 3 dimensions now, creating virtual worlds. And the team, the young team, they just sort of gallop up and like sponges in terms of absorbing how to, you know, use technology and use Revit to explain and coordinate and interconnect. But you know, I did embarrass them once when I said, do you have a pencil? I just wanted to sort of sketch something. And they looked around in a panic going, no, open their drawers, no pencils. So I think, you know, in a way, the move towards digital for the younger generation is definitely
I think there's a problem from our side on that as well. I do think that there is an issue. If you go and look at the CPD presentations that are available in regards to technology, there aren't any. I know, because I've looked. And so I put together CPD presentations specific to architects or particular types of architects and areas, and also project managers and cost consultants, because they all have a different understanding. And we have, from an AV, we understand our piece. You've got a lot of things to think about from an architectural piece, and there's all of those pieces to fit. So I think that there is there should be more of an emphasis on us, or a requirement on us to actually provide you with some of the things, because there's so much out here. We've got 45 consultants wandering around here trying to gather up all the information. So for some people to translate that, how can we make that work for you? So,
but the simple is really good too, because going back to that, you know, we've got a wonderful guy who's a young architect who's championing Revit in our team. So none of our team are allowed to draw in 2D at the moment at all. It does make me very redundant in that process. But we went into a pitch just recently, and we were showing the client project. And you know, one of the things that's quite challenging is when my architectural colleagues are looking at beautiful pictures of a building that's an object, it's very material and impactful in space. You can do a lovely image and in 2D, and it's fantastic. For a lot of what we do, we're creating nothingness. We're carving spaces from walls to create environments that's more like a film set. So how do you present that? So just recently we've come up with a really simple piece of technology, an easy technology, where we design our model in 3D to show the client, instead of us just driving it. We've got a simple QR reader code, and you click on with your iPhone with one click. Even I can do it. And then you find yourself transported into that Enscape model which is, and you take your phone and you can move around in that virtual reality world from a phone. And I think that was quite devastatingly easy and seductive for the client, because they suddenly felt, I believe what you're doing in terms of trying to create this environment internally. And I think that's interesting that it's actually going back to not just providing AV as a hardware or software as the end product. The process of making now is actually using
part
AV.
of it. Yeah.
And it can be taken a lot further. And this has been around for quite some time. I used to run Arab Sport, and that was, I don't know, from 2000 for about 10 years. And back then, we had wonderful bits of software that we used to demonstrate acoustics in a 3D environment. And so the knowledge is there to be able to create, for instance, take it one step further, where the sound coming out, probably with headphones, I guess, recreates the effect that different forms of building would have on that sound.
Yep, we do that.
You can do
provide
that
service.
now. And
it's there available.
Yeah.
It's actually, do people have the appetite? Because whilst the technology is there, actually the process of getting it designed and actually then putting that together is not inexpensive. So then is there the appetite to actually do those things? On some of the bigger projects, yes, but...
that's now, it's expensive, but in a few years' time, it'll come down to a commodity
that was
price.
the mastery of our recent sort of Pitterbeck technology. The
Yeah.
idea that you can, we'll spend a week drawing up a model, and it'll be a sketch model, but it will still give you a pretty good idea, and you don't have to be a property expert to understand, your arrival area is improving in terms of size and look and feel, etc. But anyone can click an Apple phone and you're in that space. The ease of that, I think, is what's so exciting. now.
I think, to come back to I'm going to answer your question as a project manager again, and absolutely everything we've said there is absolutely correct. I think for me, and what I hear, and I know we slightly disagreed earlier, but a lot of our end user clients are what they can touch, feel and see. And that's where they spend the money. I mean, 50% roughly of a fit out is on hidden stuff, and that excludes AV. It's AC and electric and everything that goes with that. That leaves you 50% to play with. So then they focus on, right, what am I going to touch and see? And I get, yes, for the right people and more the sophisticated clients perhaps, they are interested in the technology piece and, right, what can I do that makes me more efficient and press one button or an app. Absolutely, there's people out there that do want that, but I wouldn't say that's typical. And that brings us back circle again to how we join the dots and educate.
Good. Well, that's brought us full circle, and that's a full hour. Any last questions you'd like to ask our panel before they dissipate? Well, Christian, Vince, Helen and Jay, thank you so much for sharing and coming with us today. It's been absolutely great. First meaningful conversation we had on that subject, first public one anyway, that's good. Thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the audience.
Thank you.